Well, I'm very glad that you're here. I've had a long day. I'm sure you have too. And you're probably tired. And I appreciate the fact that you would take time to come out this evening after a long day at work and to take time to discuss some things with me. And I hope that this will be a stimulating, encouraging time for you. If you're here this evening and you would not identify yourself as a follower of Jesus Christ, I'm very glad you're here. You're extremely welcome, and I hope that you'll feel comfortable. I want to try to give you, especially, but all of us, some things that I hope will be of use to you to think about. And I want to try to give you some very brief reasons why. Hello? And that's one of them right there. Why I think there is a God that is a personal creator of the world. Last night, I talked a little bit about God and the meaning of life. I don't know if you recall, but at the end of World War II, there were the Nuremberg trials where they tried the German war criminals. The Nazi war criminals, to their defense, advanced a version of moral relativism. It was called legal positivism, and it is roughly the idea that there is nothing that is really right or wrong, that right or wrong is solely what people believe in a culture. And the Nazi war criminals said, how can you judges in other Western European countries and America fault us for what we did in the war? What gives you the right to tell us what our moral values ought to be in our culture? Each culture creates its own values, and everything's relative. And if you have a set of values in your culture that you want to live by, that's your business. But in our culture, we had a set of values. We don't expect you to live up to our values, but why should we have to answer to the moral principles of other societies? Because all law and morality is relative. Well, the judge in the Nuremberg trials made the following statement to that kind of a defense. He said, you're forgetting one thing. There is a law above the law. There is a law that transcends human law. And it is because you violated the real objective moral law that is woven into the fabric of the universe, that transcends human law. That's why you're guilty. Do you understand that if there is no objective law of morality in the universe that is above and beyond human creation, then in the final analysis, what the Germans did to the Jews in World War II is not really wrong? Do you understand that? And last night, what I tried to share was that if there is no supreme being, then we are hard-pressed to make any sense out of how our lives could be intrinsically valuable and meaningful, and how there could be objective right or wrong. And this evening, I want to move in to some more considerations as to why we can know there is a God. And I've already suggested one of them, and it is this. We all know that there are some things that are right and some things that are wrong. And that would seem to require some kind of lawgiver, some sort of creator that made us in his image to give us value. And if you deny these things, you were hard-pressed, as I said last night, to make sense out of how there could be any point to life whatsoever. Now, the truth of the matter is that you and I are made to believe in God. The vast majority of people in the history of the world, whether they have been uneducated or extremely well educated, believe in a personal creator God. The vast majority of people. It's something like 94, 95, 96% of Americans. And by the way, that includes university professors, that includes scientists, that includes people of all social classes and so on. The point I am making to you is that there is something about the way we're made, and there is something about the universe in which we live that makes it quite natural and sensible to believe there is a creator of some kind. The truth of the matter is, people do not need to be taught to believe in God. Rather, people need to be taught not to believe in God. And that's why in communist and Eastern Bloc countries prior to the events of recent years, people had to be indoctrinated into atheism. You do not need to be indoctrinated into belief in God. May I tell you this is why, now that the pressure has been taken off in those countries, there has been a resurgence of religious belief. because you and I find it natural and normal and sensible to believe in God. Paul Vitz, who is one of the top psychologists of our generation, he is a professor of psychology at New York University. During the Reagan presidency, President Reagan hired Vitz to do some research for the government regarding the public schools. Vitz used to be an atheist. He converted to Christianity, 10, 15 years ago. And he did a study of the lives of famous atheists. And he discovered that when he studied 8 or 9 of the top atheists in the history of the last 300 or 400 years, like Marx and Freud and so on, every single one of them had come to their atheism because of unresolved conflicts with their father figure or with some authority figure. Now, if you're here this evening and you're an atheist, and you don't believe there is a God, or if you're a Christian and you have doubts about God's existence that are fairly significant, I'm going to go into some reasons in a minute why I think there's a God, but I want to say something to you that's very important for your own personal health. The chances are that your problems with the existence of God are not simply intellectual. I do not deny that you may not have questions. But the chances are that there is probably something in your past or some unresolved conflict where you have some sort of desire to kill a father figure. And I urge you that if you were an atheist, you ought to think seriously. Just get alone. Don't do it with your Christian friends around who invited you if you're embarrassed. Don't let anybody know you're doing it if that makes you comfortable. But get alone by yourself and think through how you came about to become an atheist. And ask yourself an honest question. Were there significant psychological harms done to you in your formative years that significantly contributed to your atheism? And I would be willing to bet that you have a story here where that's true. I've been doing this too long to know that that is not true in the vast majority of cases. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't need to have further support for why we believe there's a creator, and I'm going to give you some in just a second. Obviously, I can only give you a brief snapshot of this thing in one evening. I'll do the best I can to give you suggestions of some very sensible lines of thinking that I think indicate the overwhelming likelihood that there is a creator of the universe. But you need to recognize that according to Christianity, and I'll come back to this toward the end of the evening, but according to Christianity, God is hidden. And he has a reason for being hidden. In fact, he has at least 2 reasons for being hidden that I'll tell you later. But a few centuries ago, Pascal, who was a French mathematician and philosopher, made a very, very interesting statement. He said, if a religion does not acknowledge that God is hidden, it cannot be true. And if a religion does not explain why God is hidden, it cannot teach. Now, I want to suggest to you that it is the case that there is a personal spiritual being who created the world, but he hides. He's hidden. And we must not confuse the hiddenness of God with a lack of evidence that he's there. So when I return to this subject at the end of the evening, I will try to say a few things about why, if there is a God, he is so hidden, because there are good reasons for his hiddenness. But to begin with, I'd like to give you a couple of suggestions as to why I think it makes more sense to believe there's a God than it does to suspend judgment on the question or not to believe in God. And the first one is an argument, a line of thought. And by the way, folks, I want to say brothers and sisters to family members, and then for those of you that are welcome guests as well, I have no desire this evening to have just an intellectual conversation with you. I really want to share my heart with you, but I'm going to have to say a few things that are of a more academic nature here at the beginning. This first argument will be the toughest to choke down. So if you find yourself a little troubled, or I'll be over it in a few minutes and we can get on to something else. This first argument is called the Kalam cosmological argument. And it roughly is an argument that says that the universe had a beginning, and that beginning was caused by something that was a person. The universe had a beginning, and that beginning was caused by someone who was a person. Now, how do we know the universe had a beginning? How do we know that? Because we do have good reason to believe that the space-time physical universe began at a point in the past a finite distance from the present. I don't care how long ago it was, 20 trillion years if you want to make it that. It doesn't make any difference to me. The point is that the space-time physical universe had a beginning. How do we know that? There are 3 reasons. There are others, but let me suggest 3 reasons for you as to how we can know, and don't have to have faith, we don't have to believe this by faith, we can know that the universe we live in has not always been here, but it's only been here a finite period of time. And the first one is the most difficult, and it goes like this. It is impossible to cross infinity. If the universe had no beginning, then in order for the present moment to arrive, it would have to have been preceded by an infinite number of earlier moments. But if the present moment were preceded by an infinite number of earlier moments, since nothing can cross infinity, the present moment could have never arisen. But since the present moment is here, it had to have been preceded by a finite number of earlier moments, and that's what we mean by saying it had a beginning. Now let me unpack that and talk about it in a bit more detail. I know you're thinking, Mabel, what have we done this evening? We could have been watching television. All right. Well, let me do the best I can. Let's suppose that this is the present moment, right here. Okay? And let's suppose that this is the past. Okay? Here is yesterday, day before yesterday. Back here is the crucifixion of Christ, and on it goes back. Now, let's try to get clear on what infinity is. Infinity is a very easy concept to grasp. It's not difficult at all. In fact, I could, if I had time, make the idea of infinity extremely precise. But if you have an infinite number of something, let's suppose I had an infinite number of BBs. If I had an infinite number of anything, it would be possible to pair those things up with the natural numbers. In other words, if I had all the natural numbers laid out and I had an infinite number of BBs, I could pair one BB up with each natural number, and that's what it would mean to say I had an infinite number of BBs. Or let me put it to you a little differently. I'll give you 2 more illustrations. If I had 10 apples up here, and if I had, let's call that a set of 10 apples. And if I formed a subset of that set by taking certain apples that were within the set, let's say the 3 green ones out of the 10, I would have 2 sets. My whole set, which would be composed of 10 apples, and one of the parts, which would be the first 3, the green ones, 3 sets. Now let me ask you a question. When it comes to finite sets, like that set of 10 apples, can you see that the part is always smaller than the whole? Can you see that? If I have a finite group, any subset of that group will be smaller in number than the whole set. Now, when it comes to infinity, that is not necessarily true. And in fact, a good definition of infinity is a set of things such that one of its subsets can be equal to the whole set. Let me illustrate it like this. Again, if I had an infinite number of BBs, and they were marked red and black, so that the odd-numbered ones were black and the even-numbered ones were red, and I took all the red ones out and had only the black ones left, I would have the same number of BBs there than before I removed the red ones. That's because there are as many even numbers as there are whole numbers. There is an infinite number of each. Let me try it again. Just hang in there now. Just hang in there, okay? If I have an infinite collection of things, there is no finite number n, there's no finite number that will tell me how many members there are in the collection. The number is infinite, okay? Now, there are many theorems that we could prove about infinity. Infinity plus or minus any number is infinity. Infinity plus 10 is infinity. Infinity plus 9,000 is infinity. Hey, guess what? Infinity plus infinity is infinity. By the way, infinity times any number is infinity. Okay? Now, I hope this is giving you a bit of a feel for what infinity's like. Now here's the point. It is impossible to cross infinity one at a time. It's impossible to cross infinity. I could start counting right now forever and ever. I could count 1, 2, 3, and I could count forever. And I could keep counting forever, and I would never have counted an infinite number. no matter how long I counted. You could always stop me at that moment and say to me, how many numbers have you counted? And my answer would always be a finite number. And guess what? No matter how long I had counted, I would have made no progress whatsoever in approaching a crossing of an infinite count. I would have just as far to go if I'd counted 15 as if I'd counted 50 quadrillion, because infinity is non-traversable. It is uncrossable. Now, try to keep clear on that. That's just a standard understanding of infinity in any mathematics text. You can look it up, and there's nothing controversial about what I've said so far. The problem here is that if the universe did not have a beginning, then how far back does this line go? Is there an edge on the line back here? Why not? If there were an edge, what would that be? That would be the beginning, wouldn't it? And there would be a finite number of moments between the two. Folks, what you have to do is try to think about what it means to say that the world has always been here. What that means is that there was no beginning, and prior to the present moment, there has already transpired in succession an infinite number of earlier moments. Now, if you think about that for a minute, what that means is that in order for the universe to unfold throughout an infinite past, in order to come to the present, it would have to traverse an infinite number of earlier moments, and that is impossible. What that means is that the present moment could have never been reached if there was no beginning. By the way, the same point is true of yesterday and the day before that. As a matter of fact, the problem is even worse than I've specified it. Because if you try to count from 0 to infinity, at least you can get started. You can't finish, and you can't get any closer to crossing infinity, but at least you can get going. But trying to reach the present moment from minus infinity not only can't be completed, because the distance you go is not a function of the direction you take, you still have an infinite cross, but going from minus infinity to 0 can't even begin. It's like trying to jump out of an infinitely tall bottomless pit. That's as good an illustration as I can give you. To come to 0, which would be the present moment from minus infinity, not only cannot be completed, it is unintelligible to even think about how one could even begin. Pick any moment on the line. Pick any moment in the past on the timeline. That moment itself would be preceded by an infinite number of earlier moments and an infinite number of earlier moments and so on. The point is then that for each and every specified moment on the timeline that represents an event, it could not be traversed either, because it would have to be crossed by an infinite number of preceding moments prior to it. The point that you need to understand is that the present moment had to have been preceded by a finite number of moments. And that finite number of moments, however many there were, had a first moment, a first event. And that first event was the beginning of the space-time world. That's the point I'm trying to argue. Now, we also know that the universe had a beginning from the Big Bang and from the second law of thermodynamics. I don't need to go into the details of the Big Bang theory. Many people think that the Big Bang theory is atheistic. Indeed, it is not. The Big Bang theory has very clear implications for the existence of God. That's why Stephen Hawking wrote his book, A Brief History of Time, because he saw very clearly that if you accept the Big Bang and an absolute beginning to time like the Big Bang postulates, you're stuck with a creator, and it's pretty tough to avoid him. And that's why he had to go to all of these mental gymnastics to try to come up with some theory in the book that he himself admitted made no sense if you tried to apply it to reality. He had to talk about imaginary time and time being able to go backwards and be in a loop instead of a line and all kinds of things. And he said in one place, my book is primarily a useful fiction that's a numbers cruncher. It doesn't make any sense if you try to apply it to real time. After all, what does it mean to have time coordinates at the square root of multiples of the square root of minus 1? What does that mean? Well, that's what Hawking had to do to avoid a beginning, because he knew that the Big Bang theory, whatever else you want to say about it, and you may have difficulties as a Christian with the dating of Genesis and so on. My own view is that the days of Genesis can be understood as unspecified periods of time. I could be wrong about that. But in any case, The Big Bang implies very clearly that the space-time physical universe came into being a finite time ago. Do you understand that? Now, there's another argument for a beginning, and it's the second law of thermodynamics. And if there's ever a law that's well confirmed, it's this one. And the second law of thermodynamics applies to each and every region of space-time in the entire spatiotemporal physical universe. And there's no reason to believe it doesn't. And the second law says that the entropy of the universe is approaching a maximum. Or, to put it a little differently, the amount of energy available to do work in the universe is running out. Or, to say it differently, the universe is approaching a state of increasing disorder. Let me illustrate it. If I were to set a coffee cup up here that was hot, the second law tells me that this little pocket of this high concentration of energy has a tendency to diffuse throughout the room and to reach an equilibrium temperature so it is at the same temperature with the rest of the room. All right? Now, if you saw a cup up here that was real hot, you would know that cup had not been sitting here for an infinite number of days. If it had been sitting here for infinity, it would have already cooled off. See? In fact, it would have cooled off an infinite number of days ago. Right? And this is not a trick. You just need to think about it. The universe is like that coffee cup. The universe has hot bodies in it that are irreversibly, the universe as a total package is irreversibly consuming its useful energy. It's running out of energy available to do work as far as the universe as a whole is concerned. And what that means, as one physicist in Cambridge said, it appears as though at some time in the past, somehow, an initial infusion of energy was given into the universe at its creation moment. Now, my point is, and this has been quick, and I do apologize. When I teach a class on this, I take several class periods to talk about this. And I try to do a better job of thinking about the nature of infinity. But look, folks, the point I'm trying to make to you is that it's more sensible, and I've given you quick considerations, but it's more sensible to believe that we were preceded by a finite past than that we were preceded by an infinite past. Now, you may think, well, did God exist throughout an infinite number of days? And the answer to that is no, He has not. The standard view of God is that God is timeless. He is outside time. He has not Himself existed inside time for infinity. In fact, time, according to Christian theology, was a result of the creation event. When God created the world, one of the things He created was time. But God typically is timeless, though now He can enter time. The point I'm making then is that the universe had a beginning. Now, you and I know that things don't come into existence out of nothing without any cause whatsoever. There's a book called The Atheist Debater's Handbook that's designed to train atheists how to handle Christians. And this B.C. Johnson, I use it as a text, B.C. Johnson makes the statement, well, maybe the universe just popped into existence out of nothing without any cause whatsoever. And I'm accused of having blind faith. Now, I don't mean to bully anybody here. I really don't. I don't want to bully you. But you've got to ask yourself the question. If an intellectual has got to jump to that kind of a thing, what price is a person willing to pay to avoid a theistic conclusion? Do you understand my point? That's a pretty serious price. There's no shred of evidence that anybody has ever found that anything can come into existence out of nothing without a cause. I'd like to see an example of it. You know when things come into being or when events happen, things cause the events. You might not know what the cause is, but it has a cause. And I submit to you, therefore, that it is most reasonable to believe that this universe had something cause it to begin to exist. I also think the most sensible thing to believe is that whatever caused the universe to begin had to be a person. And I'll try to explain this to you briefly. There are two kinds of causes in the world. Can you hang in there with me for just a few more minutes on this first one? It's tough, but I'll just try to get through it quickly. There are two kinds of causes in the world: physical causes and persons. An example of a physical cause is when a billiard ball hits another billiard ball, or when the wind moves a leaf, or when an electron or a subatomic particle dislodges another subatomic particle. Now, when a physical thing causes another physical thing, you already have to presuppose time, because what you have is one event causing another event. And so the cause is an event, and the effect is an event. Say when one billiard ball moves another, the cause is the moving of the first billiard ball, making contact, and the effect is the moving of the second. And so when material, scientific things cause other things, it is always one physical event causing another physical event, and that kind of cause-effect already presupposes time. The only kind of cause that you know about that does not require preceding events to be true is when a human being simply acts freely, spontaneously, and say, raises his arm. The point is, how can you get a first event from a situation that's absolutely timeless? Because do you see that the first event had to be created from something that was timeless? There isn't any time before the first event, okay? Or else it wouldn't be the first event, all right? So whatever created the first event had to be able to generate an event spontaneously without doing it like matter does. And that's why whatever it was had to be supernatural. Because the natural world is a world where events cause other events. And whatever caused the first event had to transcend nature and be person-like. Now that's why it makes sense to begin with. And some of you, I don't know if that helped you. At least I hope it didn't hurt you too badly. But it's sensible to believe that the universe began by an act of a person of some kind. And again, I could develop this much more detail. I have done this at the beginning of the creation hypothesis in the introduction, and in Scaling the Secular City, and in my debate with Kai Nielsen. If you have those, you can look at that. Is there more, though, that we can learn about this person? I think there is. I think there is evidence in the universe that there is an intelligent designer. Now, the vast number of people know that when you look at the human body and the unbelievable orchestration of the way organelles work inside a cell and the way the different parts of the body work and the eye works, that something like this simply could not have come about by random chance and necessity. That's why very few people, frankly, need an argument for God's existence, even though they're possible. But recently, scientists have made discoveries of two features of the universe we live in that have lent incredibly new and powerful support to the design argument for God's existence. And the first argument has to do with the fundamental constants of nature. The fundamental constants of nature. A fundamental constant of nature is one of those painful things that you used to find in the front of your physics and chemistry textbook long ago. The gravitational constant is an example. The mass of a proton, the rest mass of a proton, is another example. The charge of an electron has a specific value. The rate at which stars are falling away from one another, they're accelerating and they have a certain velocity and acceleration. All right? Now, scientists have made a very interesting discovery about all of these fundamental constants of nature, and there are 20, 30 of them. And what they've discovered is that if any of these constants had been slightly larger or smaller, often on the order of 1/1,000,000%, no life whatsoever could have been possible of any kind in the universe. Take the charge of an electron. If the charge of an electron had been something like 1/1,000,000% smaller or 1/1,000,000% larger, there would have not been any kind of atoms that could have attained sufficient size to sustain a self-replicating living system. And the same thing is true of all of these fundamental constants of nature. And here's what one scientist said when he investigated these. He said, the window through which life has got to appear, we have discovered, is a very narrow little window. They used to think that these fundamental features of nature didn't make any difference, and they could have been twice the size or half the size or had a different value. Gravity could have had a different strength, for example, the gravitational constant, and so on, and it would have made no difference for life. But they know better now. We now know that the fundamental constants of nature are so precisely, delicately balanced that had they been larger or smaller by the order of 1/1,000,000%, sometimes even smaller, no life would have been possible in the earth, or in the universe, not just the earth, but in the entire universe. Now again, what this means is, as one person put it, it appears as though the dice were stacked at the beginning. Because after all, living things are not inevitable. There needs to be an explanation for how we showed up. And since the factors that led to us are so improbable and so unlikely and so delicately balanced, it's hardly rational to believe that all of these things turned out to be exactly what they needed to be in order for life to appear. That could not have been coincidental. But it gets even more interesting when you study DNA. Perhaps you've heard scientists talk about DNA and liken a DNA molecule to human language. Have you ever heard that? There are good reasons for that. The structure of a DNA molecule is parallel to the structure of language. There is information content in a DNA molecule that gets transcribed and translated, and there is a genetic code. And the structure of a DNA molecule is precisely like the structure of any linguistic system like English or Spanish. Now, you've heard of Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan is not one of my heroes. I think he gets most of the things wrong, but I think he got one thing right. Carl Sagan is an advocate of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. I don't think there is extraterrestrial intelligence. There could be. If there isn't a God, there couldn't be. Because the probabilities of life appearing anywhere in the universe one time are so astronomically small that it's wildly unlikely. The very idea that life would appear twice in the universe without a God is so unbelievable as no rational person could believe it. And if you don't accept this, I want to recommend a book to you called The Cosmological Anthropic Principle, by two scientists named Barrow and Tipler. They're not Christians. It's by Oxford Press. It's about 700 pages. And they've spent 150 pages calculating the probabilities of life appearing once without a God. And then they conclude, there isn't a God, but life luckily appeared, but for you to ask me to believe it could happen twice in the cosmos is beyond belief. And I think they're right. So if you don't believe in God, give up the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. It's too improbable. The only way there could be, the only rational way to believe there could be life elsewhere is if there's a supreme being that just chose to create life elsewhere. Maybe he did. I don't think so. He might have, though. But the point is that Sagan thinks that if we discovered a message from outer space that had information in it, we would be in a position to know that that came from intelligence. And I think he's right. Even, he said, if we couldn't translate what the message meant, but as long as we were able to detect the presence of information in a series of sequences, we would know it came from intelligence. Now, my question is, what is sauce for the SETI goose ought to be sauce for the DNA gander. And if we can detect the presence of intelligence from information in some message that comes from outer space, why is it illegitimate to infer intelligence behind the information in the DNA genetic code? I don't know what's the difference. Why is not it reasonable to believe that biological information came from an intelligent mind? Because outside of biology, ladies and gentlemen, you never find information in the natural world that does not have intelligence behind it. Why all of a sudden, when we come to biological information, do we abandon the kinds of inferences we always make when we find an example of information, namely there was an intelligent mind behind it, and suddenly say, well, it doesn't work in this case? I see no reason for that. And I submit then that there is a good reason to believe the universe had a beginning. There is reason to believe that the dice was rigged in terms of the creation of the cosmos. There is reason to believe that the information content in biological systems requires intelligence to generate it. These are some very brief reasons why I believe in a transcendent, personal, intelligent reality that is behind the natural world. Now you may say to me, well, if there is a personal being like this, why can't I see him? I'd like to be able to see him or touch him or taste him or smell him or hear him. Maybe not smell him, but I'd sure like to be able to see him. And I can't really believe in him if I can't see him. It's not going to work. You can only see things that are physical objects. And secondly, you can only see things that have finite boundaries. The only way you can see this podium is because it is a material object with a finite boundary that allows you to delineate what is part of the podium from the background. That's the only way you can see this. If there is a God, God is first of all an immaterial spirit, and spirits are by their very nature invisible. And God is an omnipresent spirit if he exists at all, and that's why he's invisible. The other day we were having a prayer time, and my daughter said, "Dad, I'd love to, how come I can't see God?" And I went over this with her, and I said, "Honey, the problem is not just with God." I said, "You really need to do it because I want my kids to know why they believe." And I said, "Honey, the problem is not with seeing God, though, really. The problem is you've never even seen Mommy. You've never even seen Dad. You can't see anybody." I said, "The only thing you've ever been able to see is your mother's body, but you can't see her conscious states. You can't see her sensory experiences. This is called in philosophy the problem of other minds. And you cannot see the conscious personhood of other people. You can infer their conscious by observing their body movements, all right? You have to assume that I am a sentient creature that means certain things by the sounds you're hearing, but you have to assume that I could be meaning radically different things by the sounds I'm asserting that are known only to me. I'm not, but that could be true. And my point is, I told her, persons by their very nature are invisible. In fact, I'll tell you something else, ladies and gentlemen, and this is important to a case for life after death. You can't see your own consciousness. Right now, you are experiencing a plethora of thoughts, feelings, sensory experiences. You're having experiences of colors. How do you know that you're having experiences right now? Is it by being able to see your own experiences? Can you see your mental life? No, you see with your mental life, but you don't see your mental life itself. You understand my point? You can't make your own consciousness an object of a sense act. You can't have a sense perception of your own states of consciousness. Persons by their very nature turn out to be invisible. And by the way, if you're a scientist here, let me tell you that the vast majority of theoretical entities that you believe in are in principle unobservable. Quarks are in principle unobservable, so are magnetic fields. No one has ever seen a magnetic field. What you have to do is infer the existence of magnetic fields from observable effects like iron filings. But that is an inference from effect to cause. That is not a direct perception. And I maintain that it's permissible to infer God as a cause from the effect of the creation of the world and the design of the world, just like you have to infer magnetic fields, even though they can't be observed. If I can believe in magnetic fields by inferring there must be a cause for why these iron filings are the way they are, even though I can't observe a magnetic field, why is it illegitimate for me not to infer a personal creator if I find a group of effects that find their best explanation by postulating a personal cause, even if that being is invisible? I submit to you then that the invisibility of God is not a good argument against the existence of God. I think a better one is the inactivity of God. And I'll have something to say about that in just a minute. But not the invisibility of God. You may be thinking, well, what about, I think belief in God is just a psychological crutch. The reason people believe in God is because they need something, and that's why you believe in it. Well, that is an example of what is called, in logic, the genetic fallacy. It confuses the reasons for believing in something with how a person came up with the idea in the first place. I was taught my multiplication tables from Mrs. Fred, my 5th grade teacher. Now, would it be fair for you to say Mrs. Fred, she was a prostitute, which she wasn't, but if you said, I think she had a shaky character, she was a prostitute, she lived on the other side of the tracks, so how can you know 5 times 5 is 25? That wouldn't follow. Do you see where you get an idea, or the motives that you have for embracing an idea is one thing. The reasons you have for believing in the idea are something very different. And it doesn't matter to me if the vast majority of people psychologically came to belief in Christ because they needed something. That may not be why they continue to believe in Him if there's evidence for the existence of God, and so on. So don't confuse the evidence for Christianity with the psychological motives that people have for believing in it in the first place. And while we're on the subject of needing, If you're going to say to me, I believe in God just because I need a father figure, if you're an atheist, I will say to you that you disbelieve in God because you need to kill the father figure. I actually believe atheism is a better candidate as a defense mechanism called denial than is belief in God a candidate for a defense mechanism known as projection. My reason is that atheists fit a much narrowly and more tightly defined subgroup of people for which I think you could find some psychological reason that drives their atheism. Christian theists are a bizarre group. We're not alike at all. I mean, you go around the world, there are all kinds of Christian theists. It would be pretty difficult to find some psychological factor that Christians have in common that made them believe in God. So if we're going to talk about who's fiddling with the facts here, I'd have to say that it's probably those of you, and I don't mean to hurt your feelings, but if you're not a believer in God, I'd have to say that you're the one who's denying. I'm not projecting. And may I say one other thing on this about Christianity being a psychological crutch? C.S. Lewis made the point that what people really need exists. He said, how could you be thirsty in a world without fluids? Generally speaking, genuine human needs have objects that correspond to them. Now, it may well be that a person is in the desert and can't get the fluids. But the fact that people have a need to be quenched is an indication that there is something that does exist to meet that need. And in general, genuine human needs are pretty good pieces of evidence that there is at least an object in existence to meet that need. I submit to you that human beings universally have expressed a need for some supreme being. Far from being an evidence against his existence, I find the fact that human beings need God as evidence for his existence. Now, what I've tried to do is I've tried to say that the universe had a beginning. You can't cross infinity. And if the universe had no beginning, coming to the present moment would be like counting to zero from minus infinity. You couldn't begin it, and you couldn't get started. That means that there was a beginning to the space-time universe, and the Big Bang Theory and the second law of thermodynamics lend further support to that idea. We live in a universe, a space-time universe that began to exist. And whatever caused it to come into existence had to be the kind of a being that could act spontaneously from a position of timelessness. Whatever caused the universe, therefore, could not itself have been a part of the universe. Because if you cause something to happen within the universe, you already require time and sequence and events. So whatever generated the universe was supernatural. The design in the universe, especially the features of the universe that are delicately balanced, that we did not know about 15 to 20 years ago, have lent strong evidence that the dice were rigged in the creation of the world so life would appear. The presence of biological information, I believe, justifies belief that it came from intelligence, because apart from biology, whenever human beings find information, as Carl Sagan admits, that legitimatizes an inference to the fact that it came from an intelligent mind of some kind. And I don't know why we can't justify that with biological information in the same way. The idea that God it can't be seen is just because he's a person. And you can't see persons. By the way, you can't see mathematical objects. The laws of mathematics and the laws of logic cannot be tested by sense observation. There are many things that we know that are not objects of seeing, touching, tasting, smelling, or hearing. Is belief in God a psychological crutch? I don't think so. But even if it is, that doesn't mean there aren't good reasons for believing in him. Just because I came to Jesus Christ because I was sick in my heart doesn't mean I don't have good reasons for thinking he's there. Those are two very different questions. While we're on the subject, as I said, if we're going to talk about who's fiddling, I'd be willing to say that the atheist is fiddling more than the believer in God. He may be repressing rather than projecting. And I also said that needs are a good indication that something does exist to meet that need, generally speaking. Universally have expressed at some time a need for a transcendent being is a good indication to me that there is an object that does exist that meets that need. It's not a knockdown proof, but it's an indication. There's one final thing that I want to say in closing, and this has to do with the nature of religious experience. People for hundreds and thousands of years have claimed that they have had direct experiences of God. Have there been some very bizarre examples of this? Of course there have. Do you realize that the fact that religious activities can be harmful and bizarre is a sign of its dignity? To the degree that something in life is trivial, to that degree it is not possible of flagrant error. I mean, how can you have a flagrant error in playing tiddlywinks? But the fact that religion can undergo flagrant error is a sign of its greatness. The only possibility of a flagrant error in some area is if you're already assuming that area of life is indeed an important one. Can religious experiences go wrong? Of course they can. But that doesn't mean they're all wrong, and people for thousands of years have testified that they have met Jesus Christ personally, that He has spoken to them, that He has answered their prayers, and so on. Now, I want to give two examples of this before I close and say something about the hiddenness of God. God speaks to you all the time. I want to clarify this. Many people say God has never spoken to me, and that's because they're not listening for the right thing. What is communication between two people? I'll tell you what communication is. It is when someone takes a thought or feeling in his mind and causes it to be implanted in the mind of a listener. If I have a thought or a feeling and I can cause that to come to be understood inside you, I have communicated to you. Now, as a finite object, I have to use a physical medium to communicate to you. If I'm going to cause my thoughts and feelings to occur inside of your soul, I have got to use scribblings, physical scribblings, or sounds, or tap you, or something like that. I have to use a physical medium if I am going to communicate to you. But why would God have to do that? You see, when God speaks to people, there are some times when He causes visions, and when He directly, or He speaks out, He makes a noise happen. I've known people who've had that happen. Bill Bright, who founded Campus Crusade for Christ, literally had a vision. But generally, God speaks to people by directly implanting thoughts and feelings into their soul, and over time, if you pay attention to it, you can learn to discern when it's God and when it's your own subconscious. Not in every case. How do you learn to recognize anybody's voice? By practice, don't you? How does a child learn to recognize your voice? By being around it and listening. Are they going to make a mistake once in a while? Of course. If you have somebody that comes along that says something that sounds like you, they'll make a mistake. And learning to discern when God is speaking to me directly and when it's just my own subconscious or something else takes practice, and we're all going to make mistakes, but you can learn to discern His voice. I flew to Chicago a year and a half ago to speak at a conference on science and religion. I was in a period in my life that was one of the most remarkable times I've ever had in my religious life. I entered a period of about 8 weeks when God spoke to me 6 or 7 times. I had 6 or 7 specific answers to prayer that I was reduced just about every day to weeping. One morning I got up and I sat in the living room and I just burst out into tears because God was doing so much in my life. Now, that doesn't happen all the time, but I was in a period that was unusual. My daughter had a migraine headache that morning when I got on the plane. When she gets a migraine headache, they usually last 1 or 2, sometimes 3 days. They're terrible. I got on the plane and I was praying. And God came and stood in front of me. I could tell He was there in front of me. I could feel His presence. He was vividly standing in front of me. He was there. His presence was standing, not He. But He made a presence real to me. And He said to me, ask me to do something for you. And I said, would you heal my daughter this morning right now? And then He said to me, you've got it. I've done it. It's over with. She's okay. I started breaking out into hilarious laughter. I could not control myself. This was no parental self-suggestion. This was not some auto-suggestion. I knew the difference. God told me He'd done it. And I was sitting there and I started laughing. And there was a fellow sitting 2 seats away from me. And I was sitting there. I was so overwhelmed by God's love, and this guy was looking at me, and I thought, what have I done? I wasn't going to talk to him about my faith. He knew I was crazy. I got to Chicago that night. I called my wife, and guess what had happened? Her headache had been taken away from her at that time. God had answered my prayer. When I was in seminary, my wife and I had lived as single people for a number of years. And we had prayed. She was driving 45 minutes one way to work, and I was cleaning swimming pools to make ends meet, and I had a 22-mile trip to clean my swimming pools. And we were driving all over the place, and we lived in an apartment. The rent went up twice. The first year we lived there, and we had an extra fee slapped onto us because we had a freezer. And we both got on our knees one day and said, Lord Jesus, would you give us a place that's rent-free to live, that is closer to where we work, so we're not wasting time trying to make money and go all over Dallas so we can get seminary done and we can get on with your work. And we began to pray that. We didn't tell a single soul we prayed this. I went to Colorado a few weeks later to teach a class for a week and a half. I get a phone call. It's my wife. She says, well, guess what? I said, what? She said, he did it. I said, who did what? Somebody drive through the yard again. She said, you'll never guess what happened. A lady came up to her where she worked at Arnold's of Dallas, a little arts and crafts shop in North Dallas. A lady came up to her and said, isn't your husband a seminary student? My wife said, yes. And she said, well, could you all use a place to live rent-free? I've got a situation for you that's rent-free. And it turned out that there was a couple that was probably had $150 to $200 million. They had a huge house that had more bathrooms in it than I've got rooms in my house currently. They had a massive home in Highland Park in the middle of Dallas. How many of you know where Highland Park is in Dallas? It's where a lot of people that have a little bit more than I have live. And they had a garage apartment, and they wanted a couple to move in there and babysit their 12-year-old daughter when they went to Wimbledon and China and so on. And when we went in to take care of the daughter, we would go stay in the main house, and the butler fixed all the food. And it turned out that 4 of my 10 swimming pools were within a mile of the house. My pool route was cut down to 10 miles. Her trip to work was 15 to 18 minutes. It was 3 miles from Dallas Seminary. The only thing we paid was long-distance phone calls. I was ministering to guys at the University of Vermont as a campus crusade worker, a part of God's Frozen Chosen up there. One morning I got out of bed. It was so cold I tripped and broke my pajamas. It was spring, and we got football games going for guys that weren't Christians, and a bunch of us Christians would get together and play football with some guys who weren't Christians to get to know them a little bit and just to talk to them, befriend them. Now, I'm not making this up. I give you my word about all this. What I'm trying to illustrate is how God does care about details of your life. That year at the University of Vermont was the last year that university had a football team. They hated football up there. They didn't like it. They had hockey, you bet. I looked in 5 or 6 sporting goods stores in Burlington, Vermont to try to find a decent football, and I was looking for one of those Duke balls that you can throw instead of one of those little jobs that are not any good, because we were playing real ball. We were trying to have some fun with these guys. You don't want one that you throw and the wind blows it clear on the other side of the street. Well, I couldn't find one. I looked at least 5 stores, couldn't find a ball. I get a call about a week later from a guy named Carl Turner in New Jersey. I'd not seen Carl Turner for over 12 months. He had been on crusade staff with me the year before. It was his birthday. And he called and said, hey, Moreland. He used to call me Zippy. He said, hey, Zip, how are things going up there? I said, hey, they're going pretty well. How you been, Carl? He said, doing really well. And we got to talking on the phone, and he gets ready to hang up, and he says to me, by the way, could you use a football? Because I'd forgotten, I wasn't thinking about it when I was talking to him. I said, well, and I had prayed specifically for one of those Duke balls that didn't have those little white lines, but it was just a solid leather ball, specifically. And I said, Carl, I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I got a new football for Christmas, and I've got another new one I got about a month ago. I haven't had a chance to play with it. I figured you might be able to use it up there. You mind if I send it up? I said, you got to be kidding. I've been praying for one. He sends the thing up in the mail, and I open it up, and guess what? It was the Duke. Now, folks, I want to tell you something. If you're a Christian here, I want to tell you 2 things. Number 1, if you don't get your prayers answered, keep working at it. Prayer is an experiment. You have to work at learning how to pray. And if I had time this evening, I'd go into more detail. I don't get all my prayers answered, but one thing I've done is the first thing is you've got to keep working at it, and don't get discouraged. The second thing is keep a journal, because when you have prayers answered, you need to put them down. Because I have probably 50 things that have happened to me like this that would make the hair stand up on the back of your neck if you have hair on the back of your neck. If you're a non-Christian, I don't want you to think that God always does everything you ask Him, because He doesn't. And this is really the reason why, one of the reasons why God is hidden. If you're here tonight and you don't believe in God or Jesus Christ at this point, I want you to know that one of the reasons God has not done more for you, although He probably has and you've not noticed it, but the reason He has not done more is because He is hiding from you. He hides from you, and He hides from Christians too, by the way. And if you don't believe me and you're here this evening and you're not a believer in Jesus Christ, get out what's called a concordance. It's a list of words that in the Old and New Testament, and look up the word hide. Especially look up the phrase God hiding His face, and look it up in the Old and New Testament, and you will discover that God, according to Christianity, hides from people for two reasons. There are 5 reasons, but here are 2. The first reason that God hides from you and me is to let you hide from Him. If you want to hide from God, you can do it. If you don't want to have anything to do with God, He'll hide from you enough to let you have the distance necessary to reject Him. Folks, if God is the way the Bible says He is, can you imagine what would happen to freedom of the will if God were to make Himself manifest to us the way He really is every day? Human life would be unrecognizable. And the Bible is quite clear that on this side of death, God has hidden Himself enough to maintain what is called epistemological distance. That means that you can get Him out of your mind if you want to. And I'll tell you something I know about you because I know it about myself. If you want to sin, the first thing you've got to do is get God out of the center of your consciousness. Because it is very difficult to sin while God is in the center and occupying the center of your consciousness. And God hides from you to let you hide from Him. And if He's not real to you this evening, and if you've never come to know Him, it's not because there's not enough evidence for His existence. May I just pull rank for a minute? I have a long way to go. But I suspect I've studied this as much as anybody in here. And I could lecture for 50 hours on this stuff. And I do it at school. They pay me to do it. Not very much, but they pay me. The problem is not that there's evidence. If you say I don't have enough evidence, the libraries are filled with books that argue for God's existence sufficient for you to believe. Go help yourself to them and read them. The problem is that God's hiding from you because you want to hide from Him. That's number 1. There's a second reason that God hides from people, and it's not just to let you hide from Him. But the Bible says that God hides from people to give them the opportunity to seek Him with all their hearts if they have a heart to do so. Have you ever wondered how in the world you could seek something that wasn't partially hidden? If I were to say to you right now, I think I'm going to go look for my watch, I need to seek it, you'd probably say, well, Mabel, now I know he's nuts. You don't seek something that isn't partially hidden. And God hides to let you seek Him and to see if you have it in your heart to seek His face. In 1968, my junior year in college, I made a decision to stop running from God. I had rejected God and Jesus Christ, His Son, for a lot of really silly reasons. I saw a lot of hypocrisy among people that claim to be Christians, and by the way, there was a lot more hypocrisy in my life too. I just didn't happen to look under my own nose. I heard a bunch of silly arguments for against God's existence that I never tried to see if there were answers to. And I had rejected His reality for not very good reasons. I came to a point of realizing that there was a good case that could be made that He was real. The 3rd week of November, my junior year in college, I got on my knees in my fraternity house, and I confessed my sins to Jesus Christ, and I opened my heart and let Him come into me. And I asked Him if He would walk with me and make Himself real to me and help me, that I would be His friend the rest of my life. And ladies and gentlemen, that was 1968, and I love Him more today than I ever have. I need Him more. He is the dearest, kindest, most intelligent, most honorable, most compassionate, fair-minded person that exists. If you don't know Him, again, think of the fairest, most lovely, attractive person you'd like to spend time with. And you're not even smelling it. Get rid of all this garbage problem about this church or that person and concentrate on who God is Himself. But the problem is that you cannot know Him now the way you stand because He will not fellowship directly with sinful people because He's too good for that. And an interesting thing is this. The more pure a person becomes, the more painful it is to be in the presence of impurity. And it has nothing, folks, to do with love. You can love an impure person, but if you're holy and good, it's still painful to be with them. And God will not fellowship with you if you're impure, except He sent His own Son, Jesus Christ, to be executed and to die on a cross, to provide a penalty and forgiveness of sins for everything you've done. And He rose again from the dead, and we'll talk about His life tomorrow night, in order that you could be forgiven, and so He could, with His Spirit, come into your life and live with you. I'm going to close the meeting this evening like we did last night, and it occurs to me that there may be someone here this evening who has never come to a point in his or her life where he can say for sure, I know that Jesus Christ has come into my heart, and I want to begin that journey. Now let me tell you, if Christ comes into your life, it is the beginning of a friendship. You have to cultivate it. It is a relationship that will grow if you cultivate it. But you have to start the relationship. And folks, you cannot tell God how you're going to start it. That doesn't make any sense to me. I could never get clear on how people figured out they could sit in their dorm room and make up something about God they wanted to believe and say, well, God, you're going to have to meet me on my terms. The gall of it. The sheer gall of thinking you can tell a Creator how you're going to get right with Him. That doesn't even work in human relationships. If you've offended some guy and stole $500 from him, and you come back to him and say, let's make it even, I'll give you 10 back. That's not how it works. If you offend a neighbor and you want to be reconciled, you've got to do it on your neighbor's terms as long as they're fair. It's the offended party that sets the terms of reconciliation, not the offender. How much more would that be true for a being as wonderful and kind-hearted and holy as God? And He says that the only way you can come to Him is if you deal with this thing right here and receive Jesus Christ as your Savior. I'd like to ask you in closing to bow your heads if you would, please. I don't know where you're at this evening, but just out of respect, regardless of what you believe this evening, out of respect for other people, would you please close your eyes? If you have never come to a point of letting Jesus Christ come into your heart as your Savior, I'm going to pray a prayer right now that is like the prayer I prayed my junior year in college to begin that relationship. If this prayer expresses the desire of your heart, then I urge you to pray it silently to yourself after me. Lord Jesus, I need you. As well as I can, I believe you're real. I know I have done wrong in my life. I'm sorry that I have sinned against what you've told me to do. Thank you that Jesus Christ died on the cross to forgive me of my sins. As well as I understand it, I believe with what faith I have that He is alive right now. Jesus, I invite you now into my heart. Thank you for forgiving me. And please make me the kind of person from now on you want me to be. Now, if you keep your heads bowed for just a second. Jesus Christ said that it's important if you place your trust in Him to acknowledge that in front of people. And I have no desire to embarrass you this evening. But I would like to ask you, if this is the first time you have ever done this, if you would please honor me by quietly raising your hand so I could see your hand. And then I'm going to ask you after the service is over with to come down front, and I'd like to give you a free book, and I'd be glad to sign it for you and to give you some information that will help you grow as a Christian. I hate to say this, but this is not optional. If you have prayed that prayer tonight for the first time, I strongly urge you to take a first step of faith and to let us know about it. And if you've done that for the first time, would you please raise your hand so I can see it? And then come down front, and I would be glad to give you something to read. Bless your hearts. Lord Jesus, thank you for this evening. I'm so glad you're alive. Thank you for all the ways you've heard my prayers and cries over the years. Right now I pray for my sick mother in the hospital in Kansas City in her heart. Please don't take her from me now. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, and you're dismissed. And if you prayed that prayer, would you please come down and see me, and I'd like to meet you.